I want to talk about 1 Thessalonians 4 because so many people misinterpret this as the rapture. People use verse 16 and 17 to back the rapture idea. But that's not what Yeshua taught. They think they can escape all this stuff. But persecution has happened for thousands of years. You can look at Europe. Europe was embattled with the Roman. The Protestants and the Catholics had been fighting in Europe for probably about almost 2,000 years, 1,500 to 2,000 years or so. And even in Ireland, you see the Protestants and Catholics fighting. So tribulation doesn't end. Tribulation has gone on throughout generations. But we read in verse 16, it says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord." That's where most people stop, and that's all they read. That's two verses that they pull out of context to say, see, this shows the rapture. But they don't read the context. For one, read verse 18. It says, "Therefore, comfort one another with these words." Comfort people with the resurrection. Now let's go back and read from verse 13 to get the proper context of this. "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep." And you can make it's very clear if you read in John 11, John chapter 11, verse 11, it says, "Our friend Lazarus," this is Yeshua talking, he says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of his sleep." The disciples then said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was speaking of literal sleep. So Jesus then said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead." That shows you it's not just a euphemism. It is asleep. Dead is asleep. "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you may not grieve as do the rest who have no hope." See, so that's a big part of what it's about. It's those who have lost hope because loved ones had fallen asleep. Loved ones had died. We continue on in verse 14. "For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you, by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep." I read that again. We will not precede those who have fallen asleep. That's what this is about. It's to say that those who are alive, those of us who are alive at Yeshua's coming, will not precede those who have died. That's what that verse is about. You read in Acts 13, and I would just read in the whole chapter. And by the way, it says, talks about the Sabbath. which another thing people say, oh, what was done away with, but they met on the Sabbath. And he was reasoning with them. We read in verse 14, but going from Perga, they arrived at Antioch, and on the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down. After the reading of the law and the prophets, the synagogue officials sent to them, saying, Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it. So this was on the Sabbath that they went in there. And then you read in verse 27, for those who live in Jerusalem and those who Lord's recognized, nor the utterances of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, fulfilled these by condemning. But basically, when we get down to, in this whole discourse, we have where one of the things he mentions is down in verse 34. As for the fact that he raised him up from the dead, talking about Yeshua, no longer to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, I will give you the holy and blessings of David. Therefore he also says in another psalm, you will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay. But he who God has raised did not undergo decay. Therefore let it be known to you that, brethren, that through him forgiveness of sin is proclaimed to you, and we talk about, and he talks about at one point that the tomb of David is still around. David's tomb is still there. And by the way, while I'm here, it says in verse 44, the next Sabbath nearly the whole city assembled to hear the word of the Lord. So the Sabbath was not done away with. But you read about David undergoing decay, and Yeshua not. That tells you that David is in the grave. Another place to go about resurrection is in 1 Corinthians 15. Talks about the glorious body. Verse 26, it says, the last enemy that will be abolished is death. So we still have people dying today. And then we read in verse 35, but someone will say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come? You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body just as he wished, to each seed to its body, to each of the seeds a body of its own. All flesh is not the same flesh. And it talks about birds. 42 it says, so also the resurrection of the dead, it is sown a perishable body, it is raised an imperishable body. So it is raised from the dead, an imperishable body, but we don't have imperishable bodies yet. But raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is also written that the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. And talking about the natural first. And then it says in verse 51, Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but there's again, sleep. But we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trump will sound, and the dead will be raised and imperishable, and we will be changed. And, it talks about death being swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. And we read we read about this, and I would suggest reading the whole chapter. But there again, you see, we will be changed. That's the same thing that is being talked about in 1 Thessalonians 4. Those of us alive will be changed. Those who are dead, are asleep, will be raised up. So hopefully this sheds some light on this passage to give some food for thought. Shalom, shalom.